It was a busy Monday morning at Atlanta International Airport. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of travelers rushing to their gates, the scent of coffee wafting through the air, and the constant announcements echoing overhead. Flight 2847 to Chicago was preparing for boarding, and passengers lined up with their carry-on luggage, eager to start their journey. Sarah Miller, a 52-year-old marketing executive with perfectly styled blonde hair and an expensive designer suit, stood near the front of the line. She was traveling to Chicago for an important business meeting that could potentially secure a multi-million-dollar deal for her company. Her perfectly manicured fingers tapped impatiently on her phone screen as she waited. As the gate agent began the boarding process, Captain James Wilson walked through the terminal, his pilot's uniform crisp and neat, his stride confident from 15 years of flying experience. He greeted some of the waiting passengers with a warm smile, just as he did before every flight. However, when Sarah looked up and saw him, her expression changed dramatically. "Excuse me," Sarah called out to the gate agent, her voice loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Is he our pilot?" She pointed at Captain Wilson, who was now talking to a young child excited to see a real pilot. The gate agent, Lisa Chen, smiled professionally. "Yes, Captain Wilson is one of our most experienced pilots. He's been with the airline for 15 years. Sarah's face reddened. "I want to speak to a supervisor immediately. I refuse to fly with him." Her voice trembled with barely concealed prejudice. Several passengers turned to stare, and uncomfortable whispers began circulating through the line. The supervisor, Mark Thompson, arrived quickly, his name badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" "Yes, there's a problem," Sarah said, her voice getting louder. "I don't feel safe flying with that pilot. I want to be moved to another flight." She crossed her arms, her expensive bracelets jingling with the movement. Mark remained calm but firm. "Ma'am, Captain Wilson is one of our most qualified pilots. He graduated top of his class from the Air Force Academy and has an impeccable safety record. I can assure you that you'll be in excellent hands." Other passengers began showing signs of frustration. A young woman in line behind Sarah couldn't contain herself anymore. "This is ridiculous. We're going to be late because of your racism." Sarah turned around, her face now bright red. "This has nothing to do with. I just don't feel comfortable." Captain Wilson, who had observed the situation from a distance, approached with dignity and professionalism. "Good morning, ma'am. I understand you have concerns. I want to assure you that my team and I have conducted all necessary safety checks and we're ready for a smooth flight to Chicago." The terminal had grown unusually quiet, with many passengers recording the incident on their phones. Sarah looked around, suddenly aware of the attention she had drawn to herself. She checked her watch nervously. Her meeting was in 4 hours, and this was the last direct flight that would get her there on time. Mark, the supervisor, cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I can check other flights for you, but they're all fully booked for today. The next available direct flight to Chicago would be tomorrow morning." Sarah's face showed her internal struggle. She couldn't miss this meeting. It could cost her the biggest deal of her career. Looking flustered and trapped, she finally muttered, "Fine, I'll take this flight. But I want to be seated as far from the cockpit as possible." As other passengers boarded, many gave Sarah disapproving looks. Some deliberately smiled at Captain Wilson, trying to counteract Sarah's behavior with their own kindness. A few passengers were still recording with their phones, and one could be heard saying, "This is definitely going viral." Captain Wilson maintained his professional demeanor throughout the entire incident, never letting Sarah's prejudice affect his confident smile or pleasant attitude. As Sarah finally boarded the plane, taking her seat in the last row, she couldn't have known that this flight would change her perspective forever, and that the very man she discriminated against would soon prove himself in ways she never expected. The boarding process continued, with tension still thick in the air. As the last passengers settled into their seats, none of them could have predicted the extraordinary events that would unfold at 30,000 feet, events that would challenge prejudices and prove that heroism knows no color. Sarah Miller sat rigidly in her seat at the back of the plane, her designer handbag clutched tightly on her lap. She could feel the disapproving stares from other passengers, some of whom were still whispering about the scene she had caused at the gate. A young mother walking past with her child deliberately gave her a cold look, pulling her daughter closer as if Sarah's prejudice might be contagious. The flight attendant, Maria Rodriguez, approached Sarah's row with her usual professional smile. "Miss Miller, I need to review the safety instructions with you since you're seated in an exit row." "I know how to operate an exit door," Sarah snapped, avoiding eye contact. Her fingers nervously played with the pearl necklace around her neck, a habit she had developed during stressful situations. Maria remained calm but firm. "I'm sorry, but it's airline policy. I must verify that you're willing and able to assist in case of an emergency." There was a slight edge to her voice that suggested she had heard about the gate incident. Two businessmen seated next to Sarah exchanged knowing looks. One of them, wearing a wedding ring and a kind smile, turned to Maria and said, "I'd be happy to switch seats if Ms. Miller isn't comfortable with the responsibility." His tone was pointed, and Sarah felt her face flush with embarrassment. Before she could respond, Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom, professional and warm. "Good morning, passengers. This is your captain, James Wilson, speaking. We're expecting a smooth flight to Chicago today, with an estimated flight time of 2 hours and 15 minutes. However, our weather radar is showing some potential turbulence about halfway through our journey. Please keep your seatbelts fastened when seated." Sarah visibly flinched at his voice. The businessman who had offered to switch seats noticed and shook his head slightly. He pulled out his phone and began typing, presumably sharing the morning's events on social media. As the flight attendants began their safety demonstration, Sarah tried to focus on her upcoming business presentation. She pulled out her laptop, but her hands were shaking slightly as she opened it. The deal she was working on would be worth millions. She couldn't let anything distract her. A few rows ahead, she overheard a conversation between two passengers. "Did you know Captain Wilson was actually featured in Aviation Monthly last year?" one said. "He's known for his perfect safety record and for mentoring young pilots." "I heard he served in the Air Force too," the other replied, voice deliberately loud enough for Sarah to hear. 15 years of experience, and some people still judge him by his skin color. It's disgraceful. The plane began its taxi to the runway. Sarah's anxiety grew with each passing moment. She had always been in control of every situation in her life, her career, her social circle, her environment. But now, she felt trapped in a metal tube, thousands of feet in the air, under the control of someone she had publicly disrespected. The takeoff was smooth, despite Sarah's white-knuckled grip on her armrests. As the plane climbed higher, she couldn't help but notice the skill with which Captain Wilson handled the aircraft. The ascent was so gentle that several passengers had already unbuckled their seatbelts and were reaching for their overhead bags. Maria passed by with the drink cart, stopping at Sarah's row. "Would you like anything to drink, Ms. Miller?" she asked politely, though her eyes held a hint of challenge. "Just water," Sarah mumbled, aware that several nearby passengers were watching the interaction. As Maria handed her the water, turbulence suddenly rocked the plane. The water splashed onto Sarah's expensive silk blouse, causing her to gasp. A few passengers chuckled quietly, seeing it as karmic justice. Captain Wilson's voice came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some light turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. This should pass in a few minutes." Sarah dabbed at her blouse with a napkin, her face burning with embarrassment. She couldn't help but notice how calm and reassuring the captain's voice sounded, exactly what you want to hear in a potentially scary situation. For a brief moment, she felt a twinge of shame about her earlier behavior. Little did Sarah know, this minor turbulence was just the beginning. The real test of her prejudices, and Captain Wilson's capabilities, was yet to come. As the plane cruised at 30,000 feet, none of the passengers could have predicted the dramatic events that would unfold in the next hour, events that would challenge everything Sarah thought she knew about judgment, capability, and human worth. 30 minutes into the flight, the situation took a dramatic turn. The clear blue skies outside the aircraft windows suddenly transformed into ominous dark clouds. The first jolt of turbulence caught everyone by surprise, causing several passengers to gasp audibly. Maria and the other flight attendants had just finished their first beverage service when the plane dropped suddenly, causing uncollected cups to spill and roll down the aisle. Sarah's laptop nearly slid off her tray table, and she grabbed it just in time, her heart pounding against her chest. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Wilson's steady voice came through the speakers, "we've encountered an unexpected weather system. Please return to your seats immediately and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please secure the cabin. The plane shuddered again, this time more violently. A child in the middle section began crying, and his mother held him close, whispering comforting words. The businessmen next to Sarah both gripped their armrests, their previous judgment of her temporarily forgotten in the face of growing fear. Maria moved quickly through the cabin, checking seatbelts and securing loose items. When another strong jolt hit, she barely managed to grab onto a seat back to stay upright. The plane dropped again, causing several oxygen masks to deploy in the middle section. Panic began to spread through the cabin. An elderly woman 3 rows ahead started hyperventilating, and her seatmate called for assistance. The plane lurched to the left, then right, as if being tossed by giant invisible hands. "This is your captain speaking." Wilson's voice remained remarkably calm despite the chaos. "We're experiencing severe turbulence due to an unexpected storm cell. I'm working to find a safer altitude and route around this system. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. This is standard procedure, and our aircraft is designed to handle these conditions." Sarah's face had lost all color. Her earlier prejudices seemed trivial now as the plane battled the violent air currents. She found herself listening intently to Captain Wilson's voice, drawing comfort from his professional tone and clear communication. A flash of lightning illuminated the cabin, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Several passengers screamed. The plane dropped again, this time feeling like it fell hundreds of feet in seconds. Overhead bines popped open, sending bags tumbling despite the flight attendants' earlier precautions. The young mother with her child began praying out loud, tears streaming down her face. The businessman next to Sarah was repeatedly checking his seatbelt, his earlier confidence completely shattered. Through the window, Sarah could see the wing flexing up and down in a way she had never witnessed before. "Ground control has approved our request to change altitude," Captain Wilson announced. "We're going to climb to 35,000 feet where radar shows calmer conditions. Please continue to hold on. Flight attendants, remain seated." The plane began to climb, still shaking violently. Sarah found herself doing something she hadn't done in years: praying. Her thoughts kept returning to her behavior at the gate, and how now, in this moment of crisis, the only thing that mattered was the skill of the person in the cockpit, regardless of their appearance. Through the storm, passengers could hear the engines working harder as Captain Wilson guided the aircraft higher. The movement of the plane became more deliberate, less reactive to the turbulence. Slowly, the violent shaking began to decrease. "We're now at our new cruising altitude." Captain Wilson's voice returned, steady as ever. "The worst of the turbulence should be behind us. I apologize for any distress this may have caused. Our flight attendants will be checking on everyone as soon as it's safe for them to move about the cabin." As the plane leveled out and the shaking subsided, a collective sigh of relief swept through the passengers. Some people were crying quietly, others were holding hands with strangers, finding comfort in human connection during the frightening experience. Sarah sat in her seat, still trembling but now for a different reason. The realization of how skillfully Captain Wilson had handled the situation was overwhelming. The same man she had judged and dismissed had just guided over 200 people safely through a potentially dangerous situation with remarkable composure and expertise. But the day's challenges weren't over yet. As the passengers began to recover from the turbulent scare, none of them realized that an even more serious situation was about to unfold, one that would further challenge their assumptions and reveal the true measure of Captain Wilson's capabilities. As the plane settled into smoother air, passengers began to relax, their nerves still raw from the intense turbulence. Flight attendants moved through the cabin, checking on everyone and helping to restore order. Sarah Miller sat quietly, her thoughts interrupted by occasional remnants of turbulence that made the plane shudder slightly. Maria approached her row with a fresh bottle of water. "Are you all right, Ms. Miller?" she asked, her professional demeanor intact despite the earlier chaos. Sarah merely nodded, unable to meet the flight attendant's eyes. Suddenly, a commotion erupted several rows ahead. An elderly man, probably in his 70s, was clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain. His wife, a small woman with silver hair, began calling for help in a panicked voice. "My husband, please, someone help. He's having chest pains." The fear in her voice cut through the cabin's relative calm like a knife. Maria rushed forward, her training kicking in. "Sir, can you hear me? Can you tell me what you're feeling?" She pressed the intercom button, calling for any medical professionals on board. The elderly man, struggling to speak, managed to gasp out, "Pressure. In my chest. Left arm. Numb." His face had taken on an alarming grayish tinge. "If there are any doctors or medical professionals on board, please identify yourself to the flight attendants immediately," Maria announced, her voice urgent but controlled. The cabin fell silent. Passengers looked around anxiously, hoping someone would stand up. A nurse in economy class came forward, but she explained she worked in pediatrics and had limited experience with cardiac events. In the cockpit, Captain Wilson was receiving updates about the situation. He checked his instruments, confirmed their position, and made a quick decision. His voice came over the intercom again, this time with a different kind of authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I've been informed of our medical emergency. I want you to know that I'm a former Air Force flight surgeon with emergency medical training. I'm putting First Officer Thompson in command of the aircraft while I assist with this situation." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. The same pilot she had refused to fly with was not only an experienced aviator, but also a trained medical professional. Captain Wilson emerged from the cockpit, his movements swift and purposeful. He carried a medical kit and approached the ailing passenger with confident strides. The other passengers watched in amazement as he transformed from pilot to physician before their eyes. "Sir, I'm Captain Wilson. I'm also a doctor. I'm going to help you, okay?" His voice was calm and reassuring as he knelt beside the elderly man. He began taking vital signs and asking focused questions while opening the medical kit. The elderly man's wife clutched her husband's hand, tears streaming down her face. "Please help him, doctor. I mean, Captain. He's all I have." Captain Wilson worked methodically, his training evident in every movement. He attached a portable EKG from the medical kit, studied the readings, and quickly made his assessment. "He's showing signs of a heart attack. We need to start treatment immediately." From his medical kit, he produced aspirin and nitroglycerin. "Sir, I'm going to give you some medication that should help. Just try to stay calm and breathe slowly." The entire cabin watched in tense silence as Captain Wilson administered the emergency treatment. He stayed with the patient, monitoring his condition closely while maintaining radio contact with the cockpit. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off the scene. The man she had judged so harshly at the gate was now potentially saving someone's life. She watched as he worked with the precision of a skilled physician, his calm demeanor helping to keep both the patient and his distraught wife composed. After several tense minutes, the elderly man's color began to improve, and his breathing became less labored. Captain Wilson continued to monitor him closely, checking his vitals every few minutes. "The medication is helping, but we need to get him to a hospital as soon as possible," Captain Wilson announced. He pressed the intercom button near the passenger seat. "First Officer Thompson, please coordinate with air traffic control for priority landing clearance at the nearest suitable airport." As the plane began its descent toward the newly coordinated emergency landing, Sarah Miller sat in her seat, overwhelmed by the enormity of her misjudgment. The man she had dismissed based solely on his appearance had just demonstrated more skill, professionalism, and compassion than she had witnessed in a long time. But the day's lessons weren't over yet. The next phase of their journey would bring even more revelations and force Sarah to confront her prejudices in ways she never expected. As the plane began its emergency descent, Captain Wilson remained by his patient's side, continuously monitoring the elderly man's vital signs. First Officer Thompson's voice came over the intercom, announcing they had been cleared for an emergency landing at Cleveland Hopkins International Airport, which was about 20 minutes away. The tension in the cabin was palpable. Flight attendants moved efficiently through the aisles, securing loose items and preparing for the unscheduled landing. Sarah watched as Captain Wilson simultaneously acted as both medical provider and aviation expert, occasionally giving instructions to the cockpit crew through his headset while tending to the patient. "How's his pressure?" Maria asked, hovering nearby with additional medical supplies. "Stabilizing, but still concerning," Captain Wilson replied, his focus unwavering. "We need to keep him as calm as possible during landing." He turned to the elderly couple with a reassuring smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, we're going to land in Cleveland in about 15 minutes. There will be medical personnel waiting for us on the ground. The wife clutched her husband's hand tighter. Thank you, Captain. I don't know what we would have done without you. Suddenly, a new complication arose. The weather system they had escaped earlier had moved, and Cleveland was reporting severe crosswinds. First Officer Thompson's voice crackled over the intercom again, requesting Captain Wilson's return to the cockpit for the challenging landing. Captain Wilson faced a difficult decision. The patient needed continuous monitoring, but the landing would require his expertise as well. After a moment's thought, he turned to the pediatric nurse who had volunteered earlier. I need your help, he said, quickly explaining the essential monitoring procedures and what to watch for. If anything changes, notify me immediately through the flight attendants. As Captain Wilson stood to return to the cockpit, the elderly man reached out and grabbed his hand. Thank you, son, he said weakly. I was wrong about people like you. I'm sorry. The captain squeezed his hand gently. Sager's strength, sir. We'll talk more once you're better. Sarah, watching from her seat, felt tears welling up in her eyes. The parallel to her own prejudices was impossible to ignore. Captain Wilson strode purposefully back to the cockpit, his commanding presence drawing respectful gazes from the passengers. As he passed Sarah's row, their eyes met briefly. There was no judgment in his look, only focused determination. The descent began in earnest. The plane encountered the predicted crosswinds, causing it to buffet and shake. Passengers gripped their armrests as the aircraft swayed, but Captain Wilson's voice remained steady over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Cleveland. The winds are quite strong, so you'll feel some movement. This is completely normal. Please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened. Through the windows, passengers could see the dark clouds and rain that awaited them. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the nervous faces inside the cabin. The elderly patient moaned softly as the plane rocked, his wife whispering prayers beside him. Sarah found herself holding her breath as the ground came closer. The same pilot she had refused to fly with was now attempting a difficult landing in dangerous conditions, while also managing a medical emergency. The irony was not lost on her. The touchdown, when it came, was remarkably smooth despite the conditions. Captain Wilson handled the crosswinds masterfully, bringing the aircraft down with barely a bump. Applause broke out among the passengers, a spontaneous expression of relief and gratitude. As soon as the plane reached the gate, emergency medical personnel boarded to attend to the elderly patient. Captain Wilson emerged from the cockpit once more to brief them on the patient's condition and the treatment he had administered. Sarah watched as the medical team efficiently transferred the elderly man to a stretcher, his wife following close behind. Before they left, the wife turned back and called out, Captain Wilson, you're an angel in disguise. God bless you. The other passengers murmured in agreement, many nodding and smiling at the captain. Standing in the aisle, his uniform slightly rumpled from his medical efforts, Captain Wilson looked nothing like the man Sarah had judged so harshly just hours before. He looked like exactly what he was, a hero. But the day's events weren't over yet. The next chapter would bring even more unexpected developments, forcing Sarah to confront the full extent of her prejudices and their consequences. After the emergency landing in Cleveland, the passengers faced a 2-hour delay while the airline arranged for a replacement pilot to complete the journey to Chicago. Most passengers remained on board, though some chose to rebook their flights. The atmosphere in the cabin had completely transformed from the earlier tension to one of shared experience and quiet reflection. Captain Wilson had stepped out briefly to provide additional medical information to the emergency team. When he returned, something unexpected happened. The elderly patient's wife came back on board, her eyes red from crying but with a smile on her face. Captain Wilson, she called out, her voice trembling with emotion. The doctors say you saved Gerald's life. If you hadn't acted so quickly, she paused, overcome with emotion. But there's something else I need to tell you, something amazing. The entire cabin fell silent, listening intently. Sarah leaned forward in her seat, unable to help herself. Gerald's doctor just arrived at the hospital, the elderly woman continued. When I told him what happened and mentioned your name, he couldn't believe it. He said he knows you. You were his mentor at Howard University Medical School 15 years ago. Murmurs of surprise rippled through the cabin. Captain Wilson's face showed recognition. Dr. Marcus Thompson. He was one of my brightest students before I joined the Air Force. Yes, a woman exclaimed. He said you were the one who inspired him to specialize in cardiology. And now, years later, you've saved his patient's life at 30,000 feet. The coincidence was extraordinary. Passengers exchanged amazed looks, and several pulled out their phones to document the moment. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, each new revelation about Captain Wilson making her earlier behavior seem more shameful. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, raised her hand. Captain Wilson, why did you stop being a doctor to become a pilot? The captain smiled warmly. I never stopped being either, he explained. In the Air Force, I served as both a flight surgeon and a pilot. I learned that having multiple skills means you can help people in different ways. Today proved that. More passengers began sharing their own stories and asking questions. A medical student spoke up about his struggles in school, and Captain Wilson offered encouraging words about perseverance. A veteran recognized him from a military hospital in Afghanistan, where Wilson had apparently performed emergency surgery during a sandstorm. As these stories emerged, Sarah felt increasingly uncomfortable. The man she had judged solely based on his appearance had lived a life of service, saving lives both on the ground and in the air. She watched as he interacted with passengers, showing the same patience and professionalism he had demonstrated during the crisis. Maria, the flight attendant, approached Captain Wilson with a message from the airline's headquarters. Sir, the story of what happened here is already trending on social media. The CEO wants to speak with you. That can wait, he replied kindly. Right now, we need to focus on getting these passengers to Chicago safely. A businessman in first class stood up. Captain, I'm on the board of directors at Chicago General Hospital. We've been looking for someone to head our new aviation medicine program. Would you be interested in discussing the position? Before Wilson could respond, another passenger chimed in. I'm a producer for a major news network. Your story needs to be told, Captain. You're an inspiration. Captain Wilson raised his hands modestly. Thank you all, but today wasn't about me. It was about all of us coming together in a crisis. Every person on this flight played a part, from the flight attendants to the nurse who assisted me. His words carried a deeper message about judgment, cooperation, and human dignity that wasn't lost on anyone, especially Sarah. She sat quietly, tears rolling down her cheeks as she witnessed the profound impact one person could have when given a chance, regardless of their appearance. The replacement pilot arrived, and Captain Wilson prepared to hand over command of the aircraft. But before he left, he had one more task to complete, one that would bring the day's events full circle and offer Sarah an unexpected opportunity for redemption. The story wasn't over yet. The final chapters would reveal how one person's journey from prejudice to understanding could inspire change in others, and how a crisis at 30,000 feet could transform not just one life, but many. Before departing the aircraft, Captain Wilson made his way through the cabin one last time, checking on passengers and thanking them for their cooperation during the emergency. As he moved down the aisle, people reached out to shake his hand, some asking for photos, others simply wanting to express their gratitude. Sarah watched his approach with growing anxiety. Her hands trembled slightly as he drew closer to her row. The shame of her earlier behavior felt overwhelming, and she couldn't decide whether to speak up or remain silent. Just as Captain Wilson was about to pass her row, something unexpected happened. A teenage girl sitting across the aisle spoke up, her phone in hand. Excuse me, everyone. I think you should all see this. She held up her phone, showing a viral video from the gate incident earlier that day. Sarah's heart sank as she recognized herself on the screen, making her discriminatory comments. The cabin grew quiet. Some passengers who hadn't witnessed the original incident watched with shocked expressions. Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment, knowing her worst moment had been captured and shared with the world. But Captain Wilson's reaction surprised everyone. Instead of showing anger or resentment, he stopped at Sarah's row and spoke in a gentle voice. Miss Miller, would you walk with me for a moment? Trembling slightly, Sarah stood and followed him to the front of the plane, aware of all eyes watching them. In the galley area, Captain Wilson turned to face her. Miss Miller, he began, I want to share something with you. 20 years ago, I was denied entry to a flight school. The instructor took one look at me and said I didn't fit the image of a pilot. But instead of letting that defeat me, I used it as motivation. Sarah listened, tears forming in her eyes as he continued. That experience taught me that the best way to fight prejudice isn't with anger or resentment, but with excellence and compassion. Every time someone doubted me, I worked harder to prove them wrong. I'm so sorry, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. I was so wrong. The way you handled everything today. You're not just a great pilot or doctor, you're a remarkable human being. Captain Wilson smiled warmly. The video of your actions at the gate is going viral, Ms. Miller, but I believe this could be an opportunity, not just a source of shame. What do you mean? Sarah asked, wiping her eyes. The world doesn't need another story of public shaming. What it needs is a story of transformation and learning. Would you be willing to share your journey today? To talk about how your perspectives changed? Before Sarah could respond, Maria approached with an update. Captain, the media is already gathering at O'Hare. They've heard about the emergency landing and your medical intervention. Sarah straightened her shoulders, making a decision. I want to tell my story, she said firmly. People need to know that it's possible to change, to learn from their mistakes. Would you? Would you be willing to stand with me when I do? Captain Wilson nodded. Of course. Change only happens when we're willing to be honest about our mistakes and learn from them. As they walked back to the main cabin, the other passengers had been discussing what they'd overheard. Many were recording this moment too, but now the atmosphere was different. Instead of condemnation, there was a sense of witnessing something powerful, a genuine transformation. The replacement pilot had arrived, and it was time for Captain Wilson to leave. As he gathered his belongings, Sarah stood up one last time. Captain Wilson, she called out, her voice clear and strong despite her tears. Thank you for showing me what true leadership and humanity look like. I'll never forget this day. The other passengers applauded, not just for Captain Wilson's heroics during the flight, but for this moment of human connection and growth. As he left the aircraft, many passengers were already sharing their stories on social media, but now they were telling a different kind of story, one of redemption, learning, and the power of responding to prejudice with grace and excellence. But even as the flight prepared to continue to Chicago, there was one final chapter yet to unfold, one that would demonstrate how a single day, a single flight, and a single change of heart could ripple out to affect countless others. 3 months after that fateful flight, the grand ballroom of the Chicago Aviation Society was filled to capacity. Sarah Miller stood at the podium, facing an audience of pilots, medical professionals, and aviation industry leaders. Captain James Wilson sat in the front row, a proud smile on his face. 6 months ago, I was a different person, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her nervousness. I was someone who judged others based on their appearance, someone who let prejudice cloud my judgment. But one flight changed everything. The audience listened intently as she recounted the events of that day. The viral video of her behavior at the gate was now part of a larger story, one that had sparked a national conversation about bias in professional settings. When Captain Wilson saved that passenger's life, Sarah continued, he did more than just demonstrate his medical skills. He showed me, and the world, what we lose when we let prejudice limit our perspectives. In the months following the incident, Sarah had undergone her own transformation. She had resigned from her previous position and started a consulting firm focused on diversity and inclusion in corporate environments. Captain Wilson had become a frequent collaborator, sharing his experiences at conferences and training sessions. The elderly passenger who had suffered the heart attack, Gerald Thompson, was also present in the audience with his wife. He had made a full recovery and had become an unexpected advocate for changing perspectives. His story had touched hearts across the country. Today, I'm proud to announce the launch of the Wilson Initiative, Sarah announced, drawing gasps from some audience members who hadn't known about this part of the program. This foundation will provide scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in aviation and medicine, ensuring that talent and dedication, not prejudice, determine who gets to live their dreams. Captain Wilson stood and joined Sarah at the podium. The audience erupted in applause as he spoke about the initiative's goals and his vision for the future. Change doesn't always come in grand gestures, he said. Sometimes it comes in moments of crisis, and we're forced to see beyond our preconceptions. What matters is what we do with those moments. The event had drawn national media attention. Cameras flashed as Sarah and Captain Wilson shook hands, a moment symbolizing how far they both come from that tense morning at the airport. During the reception that followed, people lined up to share their own stories of transformation and growth. A young black girl approached Captain Wilson with stars in her eyes, telling him she wanted to be both a pilot and a doctor. Sarah watched as he knelt down to her level, telling her she could be anything she dreamed of becoming. The viral video that had once brought Sarah shame had become a powerful teaching tool. Airlines now used it in their training programs, and corporate diversity initiatives referenced it as an example of how confronting bias could lead to positive change. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah found a quiet moment with Captain Wilson. "Did you ever imagine that morning would lead to all this?" she asked. He smiled thoughtfully. "You know, in all my years of flying and practicing medicine, I've learned that the most important journeys aren't the ones we take through the air. They're the ones we take in our hearts." The story of Flight 2847 had become more than just a tale of prejudice and redemption. It had sparked a movement, inspiring others to examine their own biases and work toward change. Sarah's public apology and subsequent actions had shown that genuine transformation was possible, while Captain Wilson's grace under pressure had demonstrated the power of responding to prejudice with excellence and dignity. As they looked out over the ballroom filled with people committed to making a difference, Sarah realized that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the most meaningful changes. The journey that began with her refusal to board a plane had transformed into a mission to help others broaden their horizons and challenge their assumptions. The evening ended with the announcement of the first class of Wilson Initiative Scholars, 20 young people who would now have the chance to pursue their dreams without the barriers of prejudice. As Sarah watched them receive their certificates, she knew that while her story had started with a moment of shame, it had ended with something far more powerful: hope for a better, more inclusive future. The end of this story marked just the beginning of a larger movement, proving that even the darkest moments of prejudice could be transformed into opportunities for growth, understanding, and lasting change.